The more directly you try to convince someone, the more they resist. And sometimes that someone is the client, sometimes that someone is your partner, and sometimes that someone is you.
Because direct advice often runs straight into the client's existing beliefs, emotional conditioning, and what in hypnosis we would call the critical filter. If I tell a client, just be confident, just let go, or you should stop worrying, the conscious mind hears the sentence, but another part of the mind may instantly begin questioning it, rejecting it, arguing with it. That is why direct suggestions often create internal debate rather than change.
So, metaphor is not decorative language, it is closer to how the mind is already organizing experience.
Because metaphors belong to the client's unconscious world, not to the therapist's theoretical preference.
So, the therapist is guiding the process but not colonizing it. So, what I really appreciate about this conversation is that it changes how we think about resistance itself. So, resistance is not always something to crush, confront, or out argue. Sometimes it is something to move around, or better, something to understand in a different language. Hello and welcome to Beyond Insights, Advanced Psychotherapy and Practice. I am Uma Maheshwari, psychologist, founder of Phoenix Psychological Services. And in this podcast, we explore how therapy actually works in real life, not just in theory, but in the nuanced moment to moment decisions that create movement in sessions. Joining me is Nitin Shah, founder of ICHARS, the Institute of Clinical Hypnosis and Related Sciences, and the creator of the Cognitive Hypnotic Coaching and Psychotherapy Framework, which integrates hypnosis, NLP, cognitive approaches, and structured therapeutic process. Nitin, welcome back.
Thank you. Always good to be here.
So, Nitin, in the last episode, we explored the unconscious mind in therapy, especially the idea that a client can consciously want change and still be organized unconsciously around older protective patterns. And that naturally brings us to today's question. If logic and insight alone do not always create movement, what kind of communication reaches those deeper layers more effectively? So, today's episode is called How Metaphor Bypasses Resistance. Let's start with something most therapists, coaches, and frankly, most human beings have experienced. The more directly you try to convince someone, the more they resist. And sometimes that someone is the client, sometimes that someone is your partner, and sometimes that someone is you.
That's true.
So you know what to do. You understand the advice. You may even agree with it. And yet, when the moment comes, you freeze. You avoid, postpone, or somehow do the exact opposite. So, Nitin, why does direct advice fail so often while a story, an image, or a metaphor can suddenly create movement?
Because direct advice often runs straight into the client's existing beliefs, emotional conditioning, and what in hypnosis we would call the critical filter. If I tell a client, just be confident, just let go, or you should stop worrying, the conscious mind hears the sentence, but another part of the mind may instantly begin questioning it, rejecting it, arguing with it. That is why direct suggestions often create internal debate rather than change.
So the problem is not always that the advice is wrong. The problem is that the system cannot receive it.
So, in general, the advice may not be wrong, right? In most cases, when someone is giving an advice to another person, they have a reason to do it. And at least the person who's giving the advice thinks the advice is right. The problem is the question that the conscious mind asks when it receives the advice. And that is the place where metaphor changes the route. It does not push the suggestion head on against the client's resistance. It gives the mind something it can enter, explore, and then discover from within.
Okay. So let's define it clearly then. When you say metaphor in therapy, what do you mean?
Okay, so a metaphor is carrying one image or idea across to another. Instead of talking only in literal analytical language, we speak through stories, symbols, comparisons, imageries, or sensory frame that lets a person relate to their experiences differently. And that matters because human beings do not live only through facts. We live through meanings, associations, internal stories, expectations, and subjective representations of our realities.
So metaphor is not decorative language. It is closer to how the mind is already organizing experience.
Exactly. Client speaks in metaphors all the time. They say, I feel stuck. I'm carrying too much. I feel trapped. I am drowning. I keep going on in circles. I'm in a dark place. It feels like weight on my chest.
So that's such an important distinction. So they are not only describing the problem, they may be revealing how the problem exists inside them.
Yes, and that is why metaphor is useful in two different ways. It can help with diagnosis and it can also help us create a change.
Okay, so let's slow that down. So, how does metaphor help with diagnosis first?
Diagnostic metaphors help us understand how the client's mind is organizing the issue. Things like dreams or abstract metaphor drawings can be very useful. But it is important that the therapist should not rush to impose their own interpretations. The goal is to facilitate the client's own meaning making because the therapist's interpretation can easily be distorted by personal bias, cultural assumption, and theory driven projections.
And then change metaphors are different.
Yes, change metaphors help the client shift perspective, reframe a problem, regulate an emotional state, or move symbolically from stuckness to resolution. These may be therapist created metaphors like a story or analogy, or client generated metaphors where the client's own image becomes the pathway for change.
So, one metaphor helps us understand the map, another helps the client move within that map, right?
Beautifully put.
So, this brings us to one of the most important themes in this episode. Why do you emphasize so strongly that the client should interpret their own metaphors rather than the therapist stepping in and saying, here is what this means?
Because metaphors belong to the client's unconscious world, not to the therapist's theoretical preference. The same image can mean completely different things to different people based on their beliefs, their cultures, their memories, emotional associations, and their lived experience. A snake for one person can mean danger, for another person, it can mean blessing, divinity, healing, or transformation.
So, when the therapist interprets too quickly, so they may not be revealing the client, they may be revealing themselves.
Exactly. This is where therapist biases can become a problem. If the client says, I feel like I'm in a dark room, and I immediately say, that means suppressed grief, I may be wrong. I may narrow the client's exploration, and I may shift ownership of meaning away from the client. A better stance is, tell me more about the room. What do you notice there? What would you like to do in that room?
So the therapist is guiding the process but not colonizing it.
Yes, we stay exploratory, phenomenological, and client led. That is why, in abstract metaphor work, the practitioner explores the client and does not interpret the drawing for them. And for those of you who don't know what abstract metaphor is, we basically help the client by drawing something really abstract. Then the client is supposed to identify a few items within the drawing. With those items, they're supposed to create a story that they resonate with. And then they're supposed to help us understand how this story that they've created resonates with what's happening in their life. In the entire process, the therapist's role is to help the client have an abstract framework within which they can project their unconscious thoughts, and then ask the client questions which are exploratory so that the client can go within that metaphor and explain to us what that metaphor is, what it means for them, and how it relates to their life and their challenges.
Okay. So now let's make this real. So can you give us a short example of how metaphor helps with diagnosis in an actual session?
So, with respect to abstract metaphor, I've just given you that example. But let's also take a different example. Let's imagine a client says, I procrastinate all the time. If I stay only with the literal label, I may get a very rehearsed answer. I am lazy, I overthink, I lack discipline. But suppose, as we explore, the client says, I feel like I'm standing at the edge of a stage and the lights are too bright. That tells you a lot more immediately, right? Now, the issue is no longer just procrastination. The structure may involve exposure, visibility, scrutiny, performance, and overwhelm. So instead of treating the client like they merely need more discipline, I can begin to understand that this system may be protecting them from being seen, judged, or emotionally flooded. Now, the example that I've given you, I'm still giving you my interpretation of what that stage and that bright light means, right? But this is for your understanding. Ideally, when the client gives me that explanation or gives that metaphor, I would like them to explore that metaphor, and I will ask them questions where they would be able to tell me what these different things mean for them. And from there, we will decide how to proceed from here.
Okay. So can we hear that as a short session exchange?
Of course. So when you say you keep delaying, what does that feel like inside? Is एक बार क्वेश्चन आपसे पूछ लीजिए.
Can we hear that as a short session exchange?
We can. So I'm going to give you the conversation between the therapist and the client now. So let's say the client has come and told me about the procrastination issue. My follow-up question to them would be, when you say you keep delaying, what does that feel like inside? Let's say the client responds by saying, it feels like I'm about to step on a stage and suddenly the lights are too bright. I, as a therapist, will follow up with a question like, what happens in you when the lights get too bright? Let's say the client responds to me by saying, I want to step back. I don't want everyone looking at me. My follow-up question as a therapist would then be, so a part of you wants to move forward and another part is trying to protect you from that exposure? The client says, yes, exactly. Now, notice what happened here. The metaphor helped diagnose the emotional logic underneath the behavior. We moved from I procrastinate to visibility does not feel safe.
And That is a very different treatment pathway.
It is very different, but again, the conversation that I've shared with you right now, please remember it's a sample conversation. It may not exactly be this way when you're working with clients because the clients may not give you straightforward answers like this. And also, at times, you want to be a bit more careful in the speed at which you're asking questions and you're working with clients.
Right. So let's talk about abstract metaphor too. So, because that's such an unusual and fascinating process.
So, yes, abstract metaphor is a projective technique where the practitioner creates a truly random abstract drawing. The client identifies objects or shapes in it, creates a story, and then explores how that story relates to life. It works because the material is ambiguous enough for the client's unconscious to project meaning into it, while the therapist minimizes their own projection.
And the random part matters, right?
Very much. If the drawing is too recognizable, the practitioner is already steering meaning. The whole point is to keep it abstract so the client generates the story, the relationship, the significance, and the interpretation.
And this is especially helpful when the client struggles to verbalize what is really going on.
Yes. Or when there is a mismatch between what the client says consciously and what seems to be happening more deeply. Abstract metaphors often reveals material that the client was not accessing through straightforward conversations.
Now, let's move to change. Take us into one of the classic examples from your teaching. The client who says, I feel like I'm in a dark room.
So this is one of the clearest examples of a client-centered, client-generated metaphor becoming a complete intervention. Instead of interpreting the metaphor, we help the client enter it and work within it.
So let's hear that as a session.
Okay, so again, I will tell you what I would tell the client as a therapist, and then I would also give you the client's responses. This is based on a real session that I had with a client, right? So I would tell the client, all right, now that you feel that you are in a dark room, close your eyes, take 3 gentle, deep breaths, and imagine yourself in the dark room that you described. As you imagine yourself in the dark room, let me know what do you notice. The client responds to me by saying, it's very dark, I can't really see anything. So as a practitioner, I would follow by asking the client, all right, now that you are in this very dark space where you can't see anything, what would you like to do right now? The client waits for a few moments and then responds by saying, I would like to find a way out. My response would be, good. In order to find a way out, what do you need to do? And the client says, maybe get up, explore a bit. And I'll tell the client, brilliant. So what I want you to do is go ahead, get up from the bed or wherever you are in that room and explore. As you continue exploring, even if it's dark and you can't see anything, let me know what do you notice in your exploration. The client says, well, I can't see anything. I can walk by touching the wall and I can sense the presence of a door. Alright, so go ahead, explore that door. The client reaches the door in their imagination and says, yeah, but the door is locked. What would you like to do now about the door that is locked? I would like to look for a key, but I am not able to find one. So my follow-up would be, given that you're not able to find the key right now, what else might help? Look around, observe the room, and you will notice if there's anything that can help you. The client looks around and tells me there's a chair. And my follow-up, what would you like to do with that chair? Can I take the chair and bang it on the wall? Maybe bang it on the door. Maybe the door will break. Go ahead, make an attempt. Now the client tells me that I did it, but the chair breaks. Right? Now I can take this forward further. That now that the chair is broken, what would you like to do about that? Or what else do you see around in the room? Since it's dark, if the client can't see things, what else can you notice in that room around you? You will notice that the client will come up with some response or the other. The client may say, maybe there's a window, there's a crack of light, there's another route. The therapist doesn't need to try and solve this metaphor for the client. The client can discover the next steps inside the metaphor on their own. And so in the case that I'm talking about, the client broke the chair, then they looked around. Because it was dark, they couldn't see anything. But they said, when I am walking again in the room, touching the wall, I can find a window. I can open the window and then I can see if I can move out of that room through that window. And eventually that's exactly what they were able to do. Right? So the point being, me as a practitioner simply needed to have the presence to allow the client's mind to explore the metaphor and see what they need to do.
And that is the key, isn't it? The client's own mind creates the pathway.
Yes, the premise is that the mind which generates the metaphor often already contains the logic for resolution. By helping the client move from the problem state to the solution state within the symbolic world, we plant a seed for actual change and communicate to the unconscious that movement is possible. So far we have talked about client-generated metaphor.
Okay. So Nitin, so far we have talked mostly about client-generated metaphors and abstract metaphor work. Where do therapist-generated metaphors come in?
So therapist-generated metaphors are useful when we want to reframe, explain, regulate, reveal, or support introspection. These include stories, idle metaphors for relaxation, control metaphors, where you can help clients through breathing or through imaginary regulator to control their physical or emotional pain. It can include revelation or introspection metaphors which help the client generate insights and understand insights from their unconscious, and also reframe metaphors to reframe the meaning assigned to a particular set of information.
So give us one simple example.
Okay, so a classic reframe metaphor is comparing goal pursuit to catching a train. At the beginning, it can feel like a lot of effort, finding the platform, locating the coach, getting on in time. But once you're on the train, the journey becomes easier and the momentum carries you forward. That metaphor helps the client reframe the discomfort of starting rather than seeing the whole goal as an endless struggle.
So the metaphor creates a cognitive opening.
Exactly. Reframe metaphors generally create cognitive opening. It does not magically solve the entire problem by itself, but it can shift the way the problem is perceived, and that can make the change possible.
So there's also a clear Ericksonian influence here, isn't there?
Very much. For those of you who don't know who Erickson is, we are talking about Milton Erickson. He was considered to be one of the best hypnotists ever, a master of utilizing language to influence people in ways that most of us can't even imagine, probably. Right? So Erickson believed that language of the unconscious is imagination and metaphor. And he used a lot of stories, anecdotes, jokes, puns, and indirect language as ways of engaging the client without unnecessary resistance. He also emphasized flexibility in helping clients arrive at their own solutions rather than imposing the therapist's idea of happiness on them.
So when we say metaphor bypasses resistance, we do not mean manipulation. We mean a more respectful route into the client's own inner process.
True, and that distinction matters a lot. Ethically, these methods should remain client-centered, aligned with the client's goals, transparent in context, and used for benefit, not for therapist's ego, control, or performance. Also, if the therapist tries to use it for their ego, control, or performance, they may work once here and there, but generally the client is able to understand this and then they would not go back to the therapist again. So, if you use it properly, you get a lot of quick, faster, more transformational results with clients. The client is happy. If you try to be over smart with this, okay, the client can see through this. So I don't think there is too much of a scope for manipulation over here. But yeah, still, as a therapist, you need to be careful about how you're using these tools or any other tools for that matter.
So let's make this really practical for therapists listening. If someone wants to start using metaphor more skillfully, what should they begin doing tomorrow?
So the first thing is listen to the client and listen more carefully to the metaphors that the client is already using. Phrases like I'm stuck, I'm carrying too much, I'm in a fog, I'm drowning, I feel trapped, there's a knot in my chest, there's a stone kept on my shoulders. These are all doorways into deeper work. Second, do not rush to interpret. In fact, do not interpret. Stay with open questions. What do you notice? What happens next? What would you like to do about it? What changes if you make this particular change? That keeps the process client-centered and protects against projection. Third, know whether you're using metaphor for diagnosis or for change. Sometimes the purpose is to understand the emotional structure. Sometimes the purpose is to create movement within that structure. And fourth, remember that the best metaphor is not the cleverest one. It is the one that the client can actually enter, relate to, and transform.
Useful, not clever.
True.
So, what I really appreciate about this conversation is that it changes how we think about resistance itself. So, resistance is not always something to crush, confront, or out argue. Sometimes it is something to move around, or better, something to understand in a different language.
Yes, and we've had a complete episode on resistance earlier. So for those of you who have not watched it, I would recommend that go through that particular episode. It explains resistance and how to work with resistance or how to understand resistance in a lot more detail. This episode focus has primarily been on understanding how metaphors can be a very elegant way of helping clients explore whatever is their unconscious resistance and be able to work around it. These metaphors allow the client's own mind to show us the structure of the problem and often the pathway towards change as well, even in cases where the client may, on the face of it, appear resistant. With the help of these metaphors, you will be able to understand the structure of that resistance, mostly even what the resistance is trying to achieve or protect, and then you may also be able to help the client move beyond that resistance.
And that leads us beautifully into the next episode. Because once we understand that symptoms and resistance often have a deeper logic, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why do people interfere with the very change they say they want? Why do they delay, retreat, freeze, overcomplicate, or undo progress just when things begin to move?
So in the next episode, we are going to take this idea of resistance, working with resistance, to the next level. We will talk about something that many people call as self-sabotage. Self-sabotage often has an internal logic, a protective intention, or a hidden function underneath it. And unless we understand that logic, we end up labeling the pattern instead of actually resolving it.
So that's where we are going next. In episode 10, we explore the hidden logic of self sabotage. Nitin, thank you so much.
Thank you, Uma. Thank you for hosting this particular podcast. And I think while we are ending this podcast, if I would leave listeners with one line, it would be something to the effect: when a client gives you a metaphor, don't rush to explain it, enter it with them, and let their mind show the way.
Okay. So that was beautiful, Nitin. And thank you for listening to Beyond Insights, Advanced Psychotherapy and Practice. And this is Uma Maheshwari, your psychologist. And this was episode 9, How Metaphor Bypasses Resistance. We'll see you in the next one. Till then, bye bye. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye bye. Take care.